At my origin, I have my DataViz setup blueprint, which is just a data blueprint. There's no components in here at all, and nothing in the construction script. So coming into the event begin play, I have a sequence where I'm just triggering each of these custom events. And they're just here, but things were getting a little bit out of control, so I've just split everything out between the kind of bar chart, and then this is the spline option related blueprints. So we'll just run through, and let me open that a little bit. So first things first, just a basic setup where I am adding the data visualization widget, DataViz slider widget, setting a local variable, adding it to the viewport, and then setting the mouse cursor to visible and setting the input mode so that I'm controlling in-game and the UI. So that's sort of quite standard. Then spawning nominated number of columns. So I have a variable number of columns to spawn, which is a public variable, I believe. Number of columns to spawn. So in my project, I can control here how many columns I am spawning. Starting with 0, so it's 10 columns in total, 0 to 9. And for each of those, I'm just setting a kind of local index number, just to kind of use within, again, avoiding spaghetti. And then taking that index number and then multiplying it by -400 because I'm wanting to spawn 10 of these in a row, 400 units space between them, going in the negative x-axis. So that's what that is doing. I'm then passing through that index number as well, just to that hex column, should I need it and know the instance. I'm not sure I'm using that actually, but it's just a good way of pulling through that information should I need it. So the spawn transform location, I was just having to set that to align it with my world, so that's just the kind of universal Z starting point for spawning. This was when I was setting the location, but pulling in that information from the Google Sheet, so that spawn lock column where I had X and Y coordinates from a vector, and that was just another way of, rather than the bar chart spawning in a row, it would spawn on specific locations that were aligned to the map of New York. So that was just to demonstrate that we can bring in a vector as well. We'll just put that back. I actually think that needs to be offset because of my pivot point issue. Yes, 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 that's right. As does that. I'm pretty sure. Bit of a hack just to sort of fix a mesh pivot point problem that I had. So with that return value, obviously that's happening 10 times, and each time I'm adding that to the spawn cylinder array, which is a local array. So that's an array of 10 hex column actors with a terrible name. I'm also taking the debug text when I was using it and then adding in the index number to display so I could tell which column was which in terms of the 0 to 9 columns. And I'm also taking the preview highlight mesh, and I was attaching a component to it, was I? Yes, I was. So, spawn actor available marker. Now, if you watch my container and widget playlist, which shows you how to use this available marker, I'm not going to break that down in this playlist because it's a playlist on its own, which is an introduction of how you can create tracking markers in the world that then canvas slot widgets follow on a HUD. So it's quite involved, and I've just taken exactly the same widget logic and applied it to this project. So you may have noticed that so in our case, you'll see I've got column 1, 2, 3, 4 written, and as I'm moving it, the hexagon and the sphere in the middle is moving in the world, and I'm attaching a marker to that sphere, which was what we were just looking at, attaching to the preview highlight. But then that marker is being recognized by a HUD on the screen, and then writing and aligning these legends, which are on a HUD, they're not in the world. So yeah, that's a whole other thing. But you'll see as I'm moving around, they're updating in real time, and will update in real time. It is projecting the world location of the marker that is spawned and attached to the top of that hexagon, and then projecting it back onto the viewport, onto the screen. And that's how we can align our legends. So that's the marker actor, which is attached to that static mesh. To the preview highlight static mesh at a sort of relative offset, and that's that 90 again. And that was just me positioning it so it's not exactly on that marker, it's just slightly higher, so it gives a bit of clearance from the typography on the widget. We take our local reference of the HUD, and that spawned array of our hex active, we are then passing that through to a local variable on the widget. So this is the tracker HUD, so availability HUD. Again, look at the container scene and widget blueprint playlist, I think it's called. I'll add a link. And that is the HUD, which has child HUDs within it that do the tracking. I'm not going to get into that now. And here we are, just creating a local variable of that and adding it to the viewport as well. So what are we doing here? Okay, so I'm not sure we're using this at the moment, but this logic, let's just see what it does. We have a vector array, which we're clearing initially, to then get all actors of class, which we technically don't need to do because we've got that. So let's get rid of that, because that is better than that. Alright, yes. And then we are getting the world location and adding it to a height light. Love it. Highlight. Comp. I'm not sure I'm even using that. Anyway. Let's see if the penny drops a bit later. So that's everything handling the bar chart. Obviously the main kind of dynamic elements are actually happening in the hex column actor itself. But in here, in terms of the logic needed for the bar charts, that's what is spawning them in location and then passing through some of the information either to the HUD or to the hex column instanced actors. Now this is a little bit more complicated. When we're wanting to toggle between the bar chart and the spline that we're doing here, we're doing a few things. So first of all, we're spawning a spline tool actor into the world. We looked at that earlier, and there's not much in it. It's an actor that has a spline component. There's nothing in the construction script and nothing in the event graph. So that spawned actor we're just saving locally, but we know the number of columns because we have our exposed variable here. And I'm then just doing an offset on the last index. So the first index is 1 and the last index is taking 9 and adding 1, because a spline has 2 points effectively. So we need to create the start point of the spline and the end point of the spline, and then continue that, taking the end point and making that the start point of the next spline, and so on and so on. So we're having to kind of create that logic. So we have a for loop where we're taking the number. This is the kind of maths around making sure we've got the right offsets to deal with the 2-point issue, and taking that index and just creating a local variable which is spline point in array index, adding a spline mesh component, making sure the scale's just set to 1, adding that to a spline mesh component array. So again, that will be 10 spline mesh components being added. And then for each of those component arrays, we are setting the static mesh, which is this tube. And we're not actually running it on this axis, we're running it across that axis to get the kind of ribbon, which was an accident, but I prefer it visually in the way that it renders. And then we're making sure that it is that dynamic material. And then this is where I'm setting the forward axis, so I've kind of forced it to go not along the Y. If I go along the Y, then it sort of looks slightly different. It's just a kind of tube rather than, it's like that. So it's another way of kind of rendering it, but I preferred the kind of ribbon. But I preferred the ribbon result, that setting the forward axis to X. When the tangents are correct, was giving. So it's just a kind of nicer look and feel, I thought. So this is where we're setting the start and end point for each of those splines, which are all individual spline mesh components. So 10 spline mesh components that each have the same static mesh, that are then given a start and end point but are offset. So here we're taking our spawn cylinder array because we know we have 10 of those, so we're getting the respective one in relation to the column because we're using this spline point array index. And then we're taking the preview highlight and just getting the world location and using the X and Y with a bit of an offset. And for the Z value, we are pulling across highlight relative offset value changed, which is being updated on the value change slider on the data viz slider widget. So we're taking the X and Y, but we are then changing the Z position to be what the highlight hexagon Z world location was. This starts mapping out each of the component parts to where the tops of the columns were. So you can see this is the start position, iterating through, and you'll see that we're just minusing 1 to get the end position. So that should be that should say end position, because it's otherwise identical. So we're doing exactly the same thing, but rather than it being the index, we're doing spline point array index -1, so we're getting the previous one for setting the endpoint. It could be +1, you know, it could be either way. It might sort of have a slightly different effect, but you just have to play around with the numbers. That's kind of what these numbers start to try and fix. And that's just repeated. And then here I'm just sort of setting up the first standard tangents. Nothing too kind of radical there. Again, using the spline point array for the start, and then -1 for the end tangents. So they just get pulled through by using the get location and tangent at spline point node. So some of that then changes where we are doing stuff on tick here, where when we are moving the on value change slider, again, because we are automatically realigning everything to the highlight hexagon, even though we can't see the highlight hexagon because we've made it invisible, we're still moving it and making the spline snap to it. So we're actually using the location of that to help draw out our start and end points for our spline. And then here, this is where I was taking the existing tangent and then multiplying it using that second slider in the HUD, so that I was starting to get some variation on how it was displayed. I've actually taken there was a field telling me what it was saying, but I think it's about, as soon as I sort of go over 8, it sort of breaks the spline. But you know, here you kind of get a good, I've got a weird texture thing going on there that should be invisible, so one of my materials hasn't compiled correctly. But you can see if I kind of come to here, you can kind of get sharp rendering, or you can have a more flowing tangential spline. So we'll come to on-tick in a moment. The other things that we have here is, so when we're starting up, I'm just hiding the spline because we're obviously making that visible on that toggle on the HUD. So hide spline on startup, get the static mesh component array and set the visibility of each of those to invisible. And spline invisible material on anomaly fix. This is where I haven't quite worked out the numbering of those spline points. This is me trying to make that first one invisible, but for some reason something's happened to that material. It's fine there, but then when I'm launching it, it's not rendering it correctly for some reason. If you know why, do please let me know, or how. I started to try and use recompile shaders all as a console command, which I've seen written a couple of times, but that didn't seem to fix anything. Any tips, please let me know. And then the get number of splines was just using the spline spawn actor, accessing the spline component within it, and getting the number of spline points and writing that to another variable. I think I'm then using that here somewhere. Again, that might just be, that may be a hangover actually from when I was trying to do it before exposing this variable, which is number of columns to spawn, because in effect it's one and the same. So event tick. So we're writing the delta seconds to a local variable. And this is kind of similar to what we were doing before, but because we are now changing the value of the slider, we're just making sure that the start and end locations of the 10 spline mesh components are running through a for loop and updating based on the new data being pulled in. And that is just being repeated. So for the start and end points across 10 spline mesh components. And as mentioned, I've just added a multiplier to play around with the tangents. Oh, so I set it to 7 as the default. So I was obviously trying to do something here with clamping that I've abandoned. Let's get rid of those, I think. I've just broken it. I did that rather too rashly. Let's just make sure it's still happy. Yeah. So you'll note that in my graph there's a kind of orange section which is still eluding me. I wanted to use this where I am dragging and getting the preview, but then when I let go I want it to snap from the previous and then animate each of the 10 component parts, but I just couldn't get that to work. So I am animating the column height. I will persevere and try and add that in as a little appendix if I get it working, because I really want to get it working. I've been a bit too close for it and busy on other things to give it the time to make that work, but I think it will be a good thing to achieve. So I hope to add that to the end of the playlist very soon. I'll show you what I mean. This is where I started, but it wasn't quite doing what I wanted. So I need to think about this afresh, and maybe it's not entirely necessary if I can do it based on attaching the spline points to the column animation in some way, and that's what I need to work out, rather than kind of doing it overcomplicated. There might be a simpler way that just manages to carry across the animation in a more efficient way. So hopefully that's of use. If these videos are giving you some value, then please do like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. So thank you for your support.
Live long and prosper.